The scene opens to a frosty, wind-blown tundra harboring several small villages, always on the edge of catastrophe, always clinging to survival. A harsh world where giant monsters still roam free and barbarian tribes continue to live a lifestyle that they've lived for hundreds of years. This is Icewind Dale, the home of the 10 Towns, the dwarves of Clan Battlehammer, and their ranger guardian, the Drow or Dark Elf Drizzt Do'Urden. Drizzt was introduced to the world in the novel The Crystal Shard in 1988. The Crystal Shard was the first book in the Icewind Dale trilogy, which introduced Drizzt and his friends, now known as the Companions of the Hall. He was created by the author R.A. Salvatore for the Forgotten Realms Dungeons & Dragons game setting, and as a companion for the barbarian hero Wulfgar. But Drizzt quickly became one of the most popular characters in all of the various D&D campaign worlds. The story of Drizzt is complex and has been fleshed out and advanced throughout more than 20 novels and stories. He is a dark elf, or a drow, an evil subgroup of elf that lives in large underground cities and makes war on, just about everyone else, including each other. Drizzt rejects his people's society and religion and decides to venture to the far northern reaches of the surface world, where, in the process, he becomes a ranger, becomes close friends with several humans, dwarves, and other peoples, and decides to become the guardian of the 10 Towns of Icewind Dale. He is described as good-hearted and noble, and he is skilled in survival and woodcraft, and he is also an unmatched swordsman. Drizzt has become relatively well known throughout the last few years, and his likeness has been featured in several action figures and figurines throughout the last few decades. To celebrate 35 years of Drizzt Do'Urden, the Little Things is going to look back at many of the Drizzt figurines and figures that have been offered over the last few decades. The first Drizzt figurines were the metal miniature type that were produced for role-playing games such as Dungeons & Dragons back in the old days. They tended to be about 1 inch tall. The company Partha produced box sets of these small metal miniatures based on the heroes of novels and campaigns for the various Dungeons & Dragons worlds and settings. One such box set, released in 1988, contained the major characters associated with the Forgotten Realms setting of the second edition of TSR's Advanced Dungeons & Dragons game. This included 3 major characters from R.A. Salvatore's book, The Crystal Shard. The barbarian warrior Wulfgar, Bruenor, the Dwarf King, and the Dark Elf Ranger Drizzt. These pewter miniatures were sold unpainted, and this version of Drizzt was the only figurine available for several years. Talented individuals could really make these figurines look spectacular, but painting these tiny figures is, and was, no easy task. This Drizzt figurine is based on Larry Elmore's artwork for the cover of the novel The Crystal Shard. This is also the first and one of the most famous depictions of the Dark Elf Ranger. This original painting of Drizzt would give him his hooded green cloak and fur mantle, an accessory that he would be depicted with even in current iterations. This figurine was among those licensed to Rawcliffe Pewter, who would usually add embellishments, such as the crystals on the sheath and the belt, and then sold them as giftware type figurines. Many people will remember the Rawcliffe pewter cases from those crystal, cigar, or head shops often located in the local mall. It would be 5 more years before the next Drizzt figurine would be produced. In 1993, at Drizzt's 5th anniversary, Partha produced this box set based around the Drow elf denizens of Menzoberranzan, the underground city where Drizzt was born. This box set offered unpainted metal miniature figurines of many of the characters from the next book trilogy, a prequel trilogy called the Dark Elf Saga. This is the Drizzt figurine that came with this box set. This one was based on the artwork by Jeff Easley for the cover of the book Homeland. This Drizzt is not wearing the ranger outfit that he is known so well for, but instead wears the lavish purple robes associated with the Dark Elves. Well, this is a good figurine. I myself always thought it looked more like Elric from Michael Moorcock's books than Drizzt. And the next Drizzt figurine to be produced was another one by Partha. This version of Drizzt was released in 1995 and features a short cloak, scale mail armor, and a bit of an odd, almost simian face. This figurine was produced at a time where depictions of Drizzt were a little more than strange, and he often looked more like an old man than an elf ranger. The picture on the cover of the novel Starless Night was strangely based on George C. Scott. Not usually who I think of when I think of Drizzt. And the final figurine of this lineup was not actually Drizzt, but was a whole separate genre of figurines from those early days. Figurines that obviously took direct inspiration from Drizzt, but technically weren't Drizzt. This figurine was by the company called Reaper Miniatures, and it was actually titled Half-Elf Thief and was released in 2002. And while this figurine certainly could have been painted to depict a half-elf thief, I think it's pretty obvious to see where it took its visual cues. But this is actually pretty common, and there are a lot of figurines produced in those old days that could easily be mistaken for or manipulated to resemble the famous Dark Elf Ranger. A good example of this is this set of miniatures by Partha that was produced in 1996. The set was simply called Drow Pack 2, but let's take a better look at that Drow in the center. This Dark Elf was again heavily inspired by Drizzt, and I am sure that more than a few people bought this pack of miniatures for the Drizzt-like figurine that was included with it. It appears that this figurine was based on the Drizzt from the Dark Elf trilogy of books, and was adorned in those flowing capes and robes with the Drow chainmail. This is the last of the Drizzt figurines produced by Partha, and the last produced during those old days when TSR owned the Dungeons & Dragons property. Dungeons & Dragons has a really complex and interesting history, and the mid-1990s was staged to one of the biggest change-ups to the Dungeons & Dragons brand. There are many great and fascinating videos on this subject, and I suggest checking one of those out if you're interested in this kind of thing. But to quickly sum up, Dungeons & Dragons was originally the property of a company called TSR, but TSR was having a lot of troubles by the mid-1990s. TSR had made a lot of bad business choices, and to make things worse, a new competitor was on the scene. The Magic the Gathering card game was introduced and was extremely popular, putting a lot of pressure on the already ailing company. Eventually, TSR was sold to Wizards of the Coast, and it took a little time to settle out how they would deal with the Dungeons & Dragons game and all of the D&D product lines, including the books and characters by R.A. Salvatore. In 1999, Wizards of the Coast was sold to Hasbro, but that is another story. The world would not get another Drizzt figurine until a new line of figurines was released for the rebranded Dungeons & Dragons game. Hasbro began producing blind boxes of 1-inch pre-painted plastic figurines for playing the game in 2003. In 2004, the series called Archfiends was released, and this series included a Drizzt miniature figurine. Then, several years later, in 2007, they released this Legend of Drizzt scenario pack. The scenario pack included one Drizzt figure, one Wulfgar the Barbarian figure, and one large figurine of Icing Death, the giant white dragon. And this figurine was different from the figurine offered in the Archfiends blind boxes. And once again we had to wait, but then in 2011, the Legend of Drizzt board game was released by Wizards of the Coast. The board game introduced a simplistic system of rules for quick play for those who wished either an introduction to the much more complex Dungeons & Dragons game, or those who wanted a game to be able to quickly set up and play. The box set came complete with many various molded plastic figurine enemies, bosses, and NPCs. And it also included many figurines of various companions of the Hall for individuals to play in the game. This included Drizzt, his panther companion Guinevere, and Wulfgar. Most of the figurines used molds from the previous D&D miniatures line. The Drizzt was an unpainted version of the Drizzt from the 2004 Archfiends series. And the Wulfgar figurine was an unpainted version of the figurine offered with the Icing Death scenario pack from 2007.
Crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and hear the lamentation of their women.
This game was actually one of several box game sets that had the same basic rules for use in different settings. Each of the games came with a wide variety of nicely molded figurines. A few years later, in 2014, the company Creo that produces Lego-like blocks and playsets made a deal to produce Dungeons & Dragons-based figures and playsets. Among those produced was Drizzt. The Creo version of Drizzt came with 2 scimitars, a bow, and a tree with a target. Creo blocks are famously interchangeable with Lego blocks, so those that purchased this figure got a Drizzt for use with all those great Lego sets too. The same year, Wizards of the Coast released this Icons of the Realms figurine starter set that included a Drizzt figurine. Drizzt was the only character from the Salvatore novels included with this set, and the other characters were original Wizards of the Coast D&D creations. A couple of years later, the set was revamped and repainted, and the Drizzt figurine was removed and replaced with an original elf druid character. But this was an original Drizzt figurine. Here it is beside the concept model. Later, in 2020, the toy manufacturer Jada, who is known for its die-cast metal collectible figures, began creating Dungeons & Dragons themed toys. The figures are created of shiny die-cast metal, and include characters and various monsters found throughout the worlds of the Dungeons & Dragons media. One of the figure packs included a figurine called Drizzt, Drow Elf Ranger. For this figurine, Drizzt is shown holding his famous scimitars Twinkle and Icing Death, which are now commonly depicted as being colored gold or bronze and silver respectively. The silver Icing Death is molded along the back of Drizzt's extended arm. And also in 2020, the popular toy company and collectible manufacturer Funko released a Drizzt and his panther companion Guinevere in their famous and highly stylized figurine style. This figurine also featured gold and silver scimitars. But one of the most detailed and best Drizzt figurines ever offered was released the next year in 2021. Hasbro released the 6-inch fully articulated Drizzt and Guinevere action figure set. This is the first real Drizzt action figure to ever be offered. The figure was fully articulated and came with several accessories, including 2 different face sculpts, 2 versions of Drizzt's hair, and a small Gwenwyvar figurine. The figurine is used by Drizzt to summon the familiar in the books and stories. And the same year, in 2021, the statue and replica company Modern Icons produced this large, highly detailed Drizzt statue. The 6.5-inch tall statue is very well sculpted and incredibly well detailed, even having snow clinging to Drizzt's boots from his treks through the wilderness. The same company would go on to offer a Catti Bree statue as a companion to the Drizzt statue. Catti Bree, the human archer, is Drizzt's love and another companion of the Hall. That looks familiar. But actually she's a lot earlier. 2021 was turning out to be a big year for Drizzt, and this series of figurines was released that same year. They were sculpted by the company Gale Force 9. This set of figurines was produced to celebrate the release of the Dark Alliance digital video game that featured Drizzt and his friends, the Companions of the Hall. This set featured Bruenor the Dwarf King, Wulfgar the Barbarian Warrior, Regis the Halfling Thief, and Catti Bree the Human Archer, as well as Drizzt and Gwenwyvar. But Drizzt Do'Urden was not done with 2021 yet. WizKids produced this giant life-size foam Drizzt statue that same year. This foam Drizzt statue stands over 5.5 feet tall and includes a removable green cloak and hood and the Scimitars, Icing Death and Twinkle. In fact, this just might be the best investment opportunity of your life, and I can't begin to list all the uses for this full-size Dark Elf Ranger statue. You know, Halloween's a-comin', and you don't want to be the only one on your block who is not featuring a statue of Drizzt Do'Urden in their yard haunt. Consider buying a second one for that special someone. Well, anyway, in 2022, Wizards of the Coast decided to merge IPs a bit, and many Forgotten Realms characters were officially integrated into the Magic the Gathering universe and game. A process and concept that started 25 years earlier was finally complete. The company WizKids offered another version of figurines of the Companions of the Hall. And this set featured a great Drizzt figurine in a unique and dynamic action pose. The pose seems to be based on Tyler Jacobson's artwork. And this set will bring us up to the current year of this video. In 2023, Wizards of the Coast and their parent company Hasbro is celebrating 35 years of Drizzt Do'Urden. They're doing several things to celebrate, but one of the things they're doing is releasing this 6-inch Drizzt action figure, the second articulated Drizzt action figure to be offered. Besides being fully posable, this action figure will come with several accessories also, including Drizzt's trademark green cloak and hood, as seen in his original appearance, and a small crystal shard, the titular item from Drizzt's first appearance in the Crystal Shard novel. While topically similar to the previous 6-inch action figure released, this figure is actually quite a bit different, with different armor and accessories and a different face mold. But that's not all. To celebrate Drizzt's 35th anniversary, WizKids will be soon releasing this new Companions of the Hall figurine set, which will also include Drizzt's sworn enemy, the assassin Artemis Entreri. And this set of figurines, called the Family and Foes set, that features Drizzt and several of his Drow relations from his time in the Underdark city of Menzoberranzan. So here, we see that the circle is complete. When Drizzt left us, he was but the learner, and now he is the master. But not a master of evil, oh no, a master of awesomeness. This set harkens back to the Partha set that was released on Drizzt's 5th anniversary, which seems like it was about 1,000 years ago. From his first figurine appearance from the Partha Forgotten Realms set to his most current rendition, Drizzt seems only to be getting more popular over the years. Not bad for a relatively obscure character who, like his fantasy mythos, has struggled to find acceptance among those living under the star-filled sky. Thanks for joining me in this adventure into the figures and figurines of R.A. Salvatore's Dark Elf Ranger, Drizzt Do'Urden. I was a big fan of Drizzt growing up, and I'm glad to see that he is still doing well, even if I'm starting to resemble the Drizzt from the Starless Night cover. If you enjoy the content, please hit the like button and subscribe to stay in touch for future content, because we have many more quests to undertake before we discover the little things that made childhood under the star-filled sky so adventurous.